From that point on, it could be said that the plague became the affair of all of us. Up to then, despite the surprise and anxiety that these usual events had brought us, everyone had gone on with his business as well as he could in the usual place. And that, no doubt, would continue. But once the gates were closed, they all noticed that they were in the same boat, including the narrator himself, and that they had to adjust to the fact. This is how, for example, a quiet individual feeling such as being separated from the loved one suddenly became. In that very first week, the feeling of the whole people, and together with fear, the greatest agony of the long period of exile. One of the most remarkable consequences of the closing of the gates was indeed the sudden separation of people who were not prepared for it, mothers and children, wives and husbands, and lovers, who had imagined a few days earlier that they were embarking on temporary separation, who had to embrace on the platform of the station for some piece of last-minute advice, sure that they would see one another in a few days, or a few weeks later, deeply entrenched with idiotic human fate in the future. This parting caused barely a pause in the course of their everyday concerns, found themselves abruptly and irrevocably divided, prevented from meeting or communicating with one another, because the gates were closed some hours before the prefectural decree were published, and of course it was impossible to consider individual cases. One might say that the first effect of the sudden and brutal attack of the disease was to force the citizens of the town to act as though they had no individual feelings. In the first hours of the day when the decree took effect, the prefecture was besieged by a crowd of applicants who, on the phone or face-to-face with the town officials, were explaining situations that they were equally interesting and at the same time equally impossible to consider. In truth, it was several days before we realized that we were in an extreme situation, that the word compromise, favor, and exemption no longer had any meaning. Even the faint satisfaction of writing letters was denied to us. On one hand, the town was no longer linked to the rest of the country by the usual means of communication. On the other, the new decree forbid the exchanging of any compromising or prevented letters from transmitting the infection. In the beginning, the few privileged persons were able to get a contact with the sentries at the post and the gates of the town and persuade them to take a message out. This was in the early days of the epidemic, at the time when the guards found it normal to give into compensated impulses. And after a short while, when these same guards had become fully persuaded by the gravity of the situation, they refused to take responsibility for anything when they did not know where it might lead. Increasingly, telephone calls permitted at first caused such overcrowding of the public phone booths that on the lines that they were entirely stopped for a few days, then strictly limited to what were described as urgent cases, such as deaths, births, and marriages. So telegrams became our only resources. Creatures bound together by mutual sympathy, by flesh and heart, were reduced to finding the sign of these incident communications in 10-word dispatches, all written in capitals, and such it happened the form of words that can be used in the telegram were quickly exhausted before the long whole lives together of the passionate, painful passion had reduced the periodic exchange of stock phrases as such as "I am well, thinking of you, affectionately yours." Some of us, meanwhile, insisted on writing, endlessly dreaming of schemes and corresponding with the outside world. They always proved illusory. Even if some of the methods that we thought of were successful, we know nothing about it, for we never received any reply. Weeks after weeks, we were reduced to staring at the same letter over and over again, copying the same appeal. so that after a certain time words which we had first been torn bleeding from our hearts became void of sense. We copied them down mechanically, trying to by the means of the dead words to give some idea of the ordeal. And in the end, the conversation called the telegram seemed to prefer to be sterile, abstained monologues and the arid conversation of the blank walls. Indeed, in a short while, when it became obvious that no one would manage to get out of the town, we thought to ask if those who had left before the start of the epidemic could be allowed to return. After a few days' consideration, the prefect replied in the affirmative, but it added to these returnees could not under any circumstances go back outside the town, and that while they were free to come in, they were not to be free to leave again. Here again, a few families, through very few, took the optimistic view of the situation and invited their relatives to take advantage of the opportunity, sacrificing caution in the wish to be reunited with them. Very soon, however, those who were prisoners to the plague realized the danger in which they were exposing loved ones and resigned themselves to enduring the separation. At the worst point of the epidemic, we saw only one case of human feelings prove stronger than fear of a horrible death. This was not, as you might imagine, the case of the two young lovers induced to put love before suffering. It was old Dr. Castell and his wife, who had been married for many years. A few days before the outbreak, Madame Castell had traveled to a nearby town. Theirs was not even one of those marriages where officer would picture an exemplary happy, and the narrator is the position to say that in all probability the couple had not up to this point been sure that they were happy in their relationship. But the sudden and prolonged separation had convinced them that they could not live apart, and the light of the situation revenge. And the plague was a small thing. There was an exceptional case. In most cases, it was clear that the separation was the end only, and the end of the epidemic. And for all of us, that feeling had governed our lives, in which none of the rest we thought we knew well, and as already had been said, the Orionians had simple passions. It took on a fresh appearance. Husbands and lovers who had the greatest confidence in their partners found themselves becoming jealous. Men who thought they were frivolous in love found themselves loyal. Sons of who lived close to their mothers barely looked at them and instilled all their anxiety and longing into the line of her face that haunted their memories. The abrupt separation without any halfway state, with no predictable future, left us disconcerted, unable to react against the memory in the present still so close, yet already so far away. And now filled our days in reality, we suffered durably from our own suffering first, and then from what we imagined to be that of the absent loved ones, whether sons, spouses, or lovers. In other circumstances, people of the town would have found an outlet of more external and more active life. But at the same time, the plague left them idle, reduced to wandering around and around in their mournful towns day after day, exchanging only illusory games of memory for the aimless walks they likely would always pass along the same paths. And more often than not, in such a small town, these paths were precisely the ones in the earlier times that they had taken with their absent loved ones. Thus, the first thing that the plague brought to the fellow citizens was exile. The narrator is persuaded so then he can settle down here, in the name of everyone that he has then felt since his experience at the same time as many of his fellows. Yes, the hollowed and would carry constantly inside us the precise emotion of irresponsible desire to go backwards or on the contrary, to speed up the march of time. Those burning arrows of memory, they really did amount to the feelings of exile. If sometimes we give in to our imagination and indulge in waiting for the ring of the homecoming bell, of the familiar steps of the stairs, if at such moments we allow ourselves to forget that the trains were at a standstill, and if we made them sure to stay indoors at the time when the normal circumstances, the traveler returning by the evening express might reach out neighborhood, these games, of course, could not go on for long. Then we knew the separation was going to last, and that we ought to try to come to terms with time. In short, from then on, we accepted our status as prisoners, and we reduced our past alone, and even if few people were tempted to live in the future, they quickly gave it up. As far as possible, suffering and the wounds of the imagination eventually inflicted those who trusted in it. In particular, all the people in our town soon gave up, even in public, when the habits that they had acquired were estimating the length of their separation. Why it was that the most pessimistic and settled say the figure of 6 months, when they had exhausted in advance all the bitterness of those months that had come rise to their courage and the level of this trial, stretching themselves to the utmost to endure the suffering over such long successions of day without weakening, and then sometimes they change meeting with friends or view the expression of the newspaper, and fleeting subconscious or a sudden moment of foresight gave them the idea that, after all, there was no reason why the disease should not last more than 6 months, perhaps a year, or maybe even longer. At that moment, the collapse of their morals, their willpower, and the patience was so abrupt that they felt they would never be able to climb back out of the hole. Consequently, the forces themselves never think of the end of their suffering, never again to look towards the future, and always, as it were, to keep their eyes lowered. But naturally, this caution, this way of deceiving one's pain and dropping one's guard to refuse to fight the ill reward, the same time as avoid the collapse and wishes of the advert and any pieces, that they also deprive themselves of those moments, actually quite frequently, when they might have forgotten the plague, but imagined their coming reunion with the ones they loved, hence the floundering halfway between the abyss and the peak. They drifted rather than living, giving them the aimless days and the sterile memories, wandering shadows who could only be found strengthened the resigning themselves to take root in the soil of their distress. Thus the enduring profound misery of all prisoners and all exiles, which is to live with a memory that is of one use to them, even the past, which they thought of endlessly, had only the taste of remorse and longing. They would have liked to be able to add to it everything they had regretted having not done, when they could do it, with the person of whom they were waiting, just as they brought the absence one into every situation of their lives as prisoners, even the relativity of happy ones, making them inevitable dissatisfied with what they had now, impatient with the present, hostile to the past, and deprived of the future. We really did have to resemble those of whom justice or human hatred had forced to live behind bars. The last resort, the only way to escape inevitable holiday, was to make the trains run again in our imagination, and to fill the hours with the repeated ringing of the doorbells, however the silent observatory reminded. But through the exile, the most cases of exile at home, and through the narrator only suffered the ordinary exile, he should not forget those, like the journalists, were embarrassed, and the others whose situation was different, and for whom the pain of separation was amplified by the fact that being travelers surprised by the plague, In a town they were separated not only from the person of whom they could not return, but from their homes as well. In midst of the general exile, they were the most exiled because the time aroused in them, as in all of us, that anguish the particular to it. They were trapped in a particular space and were constantly running up against the barriers of separation this pestilence repeated from their lost homes. This, no doubt, were the people one saw wandering at any time of day through the dusty town, silently invoking evenings that they were alone, could not the morning in their own lands. They were nourished by the pains of improbable signs and discontinuing messages, like the flight of swallows, the rosy sunsets, or those particular rays of sun sometimes cast on the empty streets. They closed their eyes to the external world, which always offered an escape from anything, stubbornly narrating their all too real fantasies and persuading with all their strength the image of land in which the certain light, 2 or 3 hills, of favorable trees and faces of women composed climate that nothing could replace. To speak more particularly, the last of the lovers, who are the most interesting group, are the ones whom the narrator perhaps better qualified to speak. They still found themselves tormented by other anguishes, among which one should mention remorse. Their situation allowed them to consider their feelings with a short and feverishly objectivity, and it was rare, at such a time, for one did not see one's own shortcoming clearly. First occasion of this difficulty they had in imagining precisely the absent person, action, and gestures. They deplored the fact that they knew nothing about how their lover once spent their time. They felt guilty about the past failures to find this out, and having pretended to believe that for a person in love, their beloved actions are not the source of every joy. From then on, it was easy for them to go back through the story of their love, examine the imperfections. In a normal time, we were aware, consciously or not, that there is no love which cannot be surpassed. Yet we accept the greater or lesser degree of equanimity, and our shall remain maritally average. But memory is more damning, and in a highly significant way, the misfortunate that attack us from that side, and which affected the whole town, did not only bring us to the unjust suffering about which we might have the complaint, but also forced to make ourselves suffer, so made us constant pain. This was one of the diseases had the distracting attention of confusing the issue. Hence each one of us had to accept the living from day to day alone in the sight of heaven, the general abandonment which might in the long run for characters, begun however by making life futile. For some of our fellow citizens, for example, they were now subject to another form of slavery, the one that made subservient to the sun and rain. Seeing them, you would have thought that the first time they were experienced the direct impression of the weather. Their faces would light up at the simple appearance of the golden light. The rainy days would cast a thick veil across the features and their thoughts. A few weeks earlier, they had been able to escape the weakness and the unreachable subjugation because they were not alone in the world, and for some extent the other person who lived with them stood in front of the universe. From this moment, however, it seemed to have hardened over the whim of the heavens, which is to say that they hoped to suffer without reason. Finally, in the extremes of loneliness, one could hope for help from his neighbors, and everyone remained alone with his anxieties. If one of us by chance tried to confide in someone or describe something he was feeling, more of the time the reply he would receive, whatever it was, would wound him. It was then he realized that the other person he was talking to about the same thing would be experiencing himself from the depths of meditation and suffering, an image that he wanted to communicate, having been long-tempered in the fire of waiting passion. The other person, meanwhile, imagined a conventional emotion suffering that had hawked around the marketplace, the mass-produced melancholy. Whether well-meant or not, the reply would always strike the wrong note and have to be abandoned, or at least for those whom silence was unbearable, since others could not find true language of the heart. They resigned themselves to using the language of the marketplace, and themselves speaking in the conversational manner that the simple account or newspaper reports, which is to some extent the daily chronicle of events. Here too, the most authentic suffering of habitually translated into the binary cliches of conversation. Though only at the price of the prisoners of plague could obtain the compassion for the concierge or gain the interest of the audience. Yet the most important thing is, however painful these sufferings were, however heavy the hearts was to bear. Through empty, one could say that the first stage of the plague, these exiles were the privileged ones. The very moment when inhabitants of the town started to panic, their thoughts were entirely concerned with the person for whom they were waiting. The egotism of love protected them in the midst of the general distress, and if they did think about the plague, it was always the one, only to the extent that it risked making their separation eternal. Thus, at the very heart of the epidemic, presented the statutorial detachment of people who were inclined to make the cool-handed compose. Their despair saved them from panic, so that some good in the misfortune. For example, if it happened that one of them did succumb to disease, it almost always before it became aware of it, dragging away from the long dialogue that he was holding inside him, with the shadow he could then be forthwith instilled deep in silence of the earth. He had no time for anything.